Hello, everyone. Today I wanted to focus on a really remarkable literary project by a contemporary poet that I've come across, and this is Arya Ligi's Romantic series. It's a 14-book series about romantic poets, some famous, others obscure. Each volume is a conversation with a different writer or cultural figure from the Romantic era and the orbit that they moved in. Arya Ligi has been working on this project for a very long time. It's basically her life's work. And so I wanted to just talk a little bit about it and focus on some of the poetry there. So this is a review of the series as a whole. I'm not going to be focusing on each individual volume in depth, which you could easily do. There's more than 2,000 pages of material here, so this is definitely an oeuvre to be studied. But what I want to do is just choose one poem from each volume that I think is somewhat representative of the whole and just analyze it in that way. Admittedly, this is a reductive approach which doesn't do justice to the project. Each volume is basically a biography in verse of the central figure in question, along with many of the other people who were in that poet's life. So let's dive in, shall we? The first volume is Hymn to Equity, Poems for William Wordsworth. So this book responds to Wordsworth's focus on ordinary life, memory, nature. Now the title, Equity, is a reference to Wordsworth's early life as a revolutionary when he was in France, when he was writing his early poetry. And the poet does argue that this is an ideal to aspire to. However, she also does present a balanced view of Wordsworth's life over the course of his very long career, which shifted more towards conservatism towards the end, and he was kind of spurned by contemporaries like, Robert Browning, who thought that he had betrayed his ideals. But Ligi focuses on the whole of his life, and she also focuses on the women in his life, who often came to bad ends. Wordsworth had a very long life and a very tragic one. He lost almost everyone who was dear to him. And there are a number of poems that take a sympathetic look at these forgotten people from history. So let's just have a look at the title poem in the collection, Hymn to Equity. Between blood and pen lives men. O equity, that oft sought white, scintillating, singing through prophetic colloquies. Verse, that stately choir. Equity, she sits atop a spire, shifting, tottering on the saber's nib, daring to bisect us if we move. O dainty, heavenly, moral affectation, let us not fall into the ether through abominations. So the poem here personifies equity as something precarious and sharp, poised between violence, blood, saber, and writing, pen, nib. We do have a strong opening line here. Between blood and pen lives men. The poem argues that fairness is delicate. One wrong move and it bisects us. The voice mixes prayer, the O, with a warning, and the main tension is between these two tools, the sword and the pen. And so just a note on Ligi's style here. You'll notice here that she does employ rhyme, but not consistently in a set stanzaic form. And she will employ a lot of slant rhyme or near rhyme throughout this volume, throughout her work in general. It does make for a delightful effect when you come across the rhymes without falling into a predictable pattern. Now, I would say that the pitfall of this style, because I know another poet who does this, an epic poet named Joseph Sale, the pitfall of this style could be that because it's not predictable, there are times when I'll come across a slant rhyme and I'll say to myself, did she intend this slant rhyme or is it just accidental? I mean, when it's a perfect rhyme, you can be pretty certain that it's deliberate, but because there are varying degrees of near rhyme, ranging from near rhyme to far near rhyme, your consonant rhymes, your I rhymes, your half rhymes, on rare occasions, I do question how intentional that oral effect is. Although that's not the case here, we have one perfect rhyming pair and then a near rhyming pair in the final couplet. So if we move on to volume 2, commemorating life, poems for Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Coleridge is one of these poets who had this life that has become kind of like the stereotype almost of the romantic artist. He had this very tumultuous life. And so because his life was a very turbulent one full of drug abuse, there is a lot of weather imagery that we come across here in this volume, which is apt. Coleridge's work moves between high vision and a kind of more ordinary doubt, and this book places him at that kind of intersection, watches how a mind handles intensity and recovery. So if we look at Night Storms, which is an early poem in the piece, and also the title of the first section of the book. Tremors shook me, night consumed me, under the sweat and tear-torn sheets. In the e'en blank opaque rage, hideous distortions arrayed, muzzy fears, ne'er to be allayed. Yea, didst they o'ertake me, making me their crazed slave, incoherent cherub, at once slack-jawed, addled, and hopelessly depraved. In that ambient hour, where the line 'tis no more, visions howl searing lips. Black-crusted omens cursing me, nostalgic hobos, their eerie apocalyptic strange shrieking, heard rattling e'en draymen's ears. 'Tis this a phantom's delusive cry, 'neath cambric threads dressing life. Bed, the truth doth oft reside. So if we look at the bottom of the poem, we see that there is a footnote here about how Coleridge had night terrors throughout his life, in which he would see monsters chasing him and wake soaked in sweat and screaming in horror. And one thing I like about these volumes is their scholarly approach. Each volume has an introduction placing the figure in their context, and poems are often accompanied by footnotes that explain some aspect of the poet's biography. And here I need to stop and say a word on Liji's literary voice. You probably noticed it when I was reading that her style is this unique blend of the modern and the traditional. She will mix archaisms, tis, or, ne'er, with more modern turns of phrase. And it can be jarring sometimes, which is intentional. Usually you will encounter archaic diction in the work of amateur poets who are trying to imitate Shakespeare, but they don't really know what they're doing. Now, she's able to get away with the archaic language because her subjects are historical ones. These are people who lived, 200 years ago. And so you get language that feels ceremonial, but still alive, a bit like a period drama with a present-day heartbeat, if that makes sense. So here in this poem, we have a few archaisms mixed with that unusual word towards the end, cambric threads. Her use of unusual diction is tightly controlled. She doesn't throw a lot of obscure words around all over the place. Once or twice in a poem is enough to get the sense across. Coming to volume 3, we have Orphaned Sparrow, poems for Dorothy Wordsworth, the sister of William Wordsworth and also a poet, albeit not as famous as her brother. Dorothy kept journals throughout her life, and she documented her daily life with great precision. And so this book treats that record as a serious work rather than just a background. There's a lot of attention to ordinary life and household tasks here. Repair, cleaning, keeping track of objects. These are shown as forms of care and memory. And we can see this if we look at Torn Trousseau. 6 years and no more, we dwelt in that bliss, wrapped treasures dandling, tucked, and sweetly trussed. Pilgrim sure, riding grandly in our cribs, then a stiff northeaster wither shins, blue, callous, callow, hollow bells, felled our nestled berth. Out from splendorous quilts laced in lilies, and Susan's gay limbs, the darkened eye popped. A tear bidding childhood's feverish fears, that I, in my cambric soft threads, 'twas sate, out as a foundling away from the veil, filial feathers, strange tuneful musing, 'twas not the same, a funeral for them. For the awning, vines sown as foliage, round porticos I, a waif in mourning. And here we have another footnote that puts this poem in context. We see Dorothy's mother died when she was 6, and her father died 3 years later. So their familial bliss, when they were all together, consisted of only 6 years. And Dorothy was separated from her brothers for 9 years. So this is one of the first poems in the book, and it sets the tone. There's a focus on these mundane tasks, and as the footnote tells us, the tragedies of daily life that were so common back then, involving death and separation. So here we have a few more unusual words than last time. We encounter this cambric again, and then there's dandling, and then withershins. And here we notice that the stanzas and line lengths are a bit more regular, more standard, though not entirely. So I'm a metricist, and I have kind of the same feeling about doing meter inconsistently as I do about inconsistent rhyme. So if you notice, one of the lines is, out as a foundling away from the veil. Now, that is actually perfectly dactylic. But there are no other dactylic lines, which leads me to ask, were the dactyls accidental or no? Because there's no predictable scheme, I am left wondering. Although it is a marvelous line. Great descriptions, splendorous quilts laced in lilies, those alliterations of L's, and that mix of the Latinate and Saxon diction that makes the English language so unique. And so in volume 4, Escape from the Nether Pit, we again have another female figure represented, and that is Mary Shelley, a famous novelist rather than a famous poet. And again, as with Dorothy Wordsworth, there is a focus on everyday life, managing responsibility, caretaking, making life. And so let's turn to one of the poems in the middle of this volume, and that is Implications Acknowledged. Unacknowledged, this blackening stain ran as poison through our veins and kissed the lips of Providence. In the din of lordly breath, darkened shadows beneath our window slept, whilst unforeseen, except in dreams, their guileless forms lay low and spent, knew not our duplicity, nor the hand that slipped, unveiled mortality. And if we notice here the effect of the caesuras, the pauses in the middle of the lines, and the internal rhymes with unforeseen, dreams, duplicity, mortality, breath, slept, also slept and spent at the end of the line, and then stain and veins. So you have some near rhymes at the end, but then also the internal rhymes interacting with the end rhymes. And again, this mix of the modern and traditional, you have this blending of the mundane with the sublime, which accurately reflects, I think, the subject matter. Because, we have these romantic figures that are often very heroicized, right? I mean, they're presented as these larger than life figures, and yet here we're just seeing their mundane everyday lives and the tragedies that often belie that larger than life image, but then also curiously feed it at the same time. Because the whole, live fast, die young philosophy does get kind of blown out of proportion. And we see that here for what it is. It's just very sad. So let's look at bygone days. Glorious roads have I tread, beset over syllables and the breadth of your being. O Shelley among the sea, cast as you are far from me, my feet which softly went to our Genoa, now no more to know that dulcet timbre of the play, nor your sweet voice drifting darkly off the page. So no footnote for this one, and we just have a short one stanza poem with short lines, and just the one perfect rhyme there, see with me, in the middle. And really we just have an elegy to Percy Shelley here. The speaker is remembering travel, the glorious roads I have tread, and a specific place, Genoa, contrasting those living memories with an absence that's now filled by the text. That sweet voice drifting darkly off the page. You have two kinds of presence here, the embodied, the roads and the feet and the sea, and then the textual, the syllables and the page. So it's a direct and private tone, less of a monument, Ozymandias, more of a letter. So in volume 5, Sweeter Than Honey, Poems for Percy Bysshe Shelley, we come to Mary's husband. And Shelley, of course, is, one of these live fast, die young guys. And this book really respects that energy while at the same time asking what it costs. The book treats Shelley as both a public voice of reform, free thought, anti-hierarchy, etc., and a private one we see his love, friendships, illnesses. And we see that Shelley's ideals show up in his daily choices as much as his published manifestos. The author's note frames that intent directly. We see that after Shelley's death, it was really Mary Shelley's editorial labor that kept the work alive. The book is a sequence of mostly short lyrics grouped by phases of Shelley's life. So early pieces track his school, his class pressure at Eton, midsection turns to Ireland and pamphleteering. Then we have the love poems, are centered on Mary, and then public poems that deal with specific events like Peterloo. Later sections return to sea work, illness, elegy. And we close on a very nice Ars Poetica, and a tribute, a eulogy to poetry. And I would just say something about the general nature of the pieces in all these volumes, that they do have a tight focus. Most of the poems focus on, one event, one moment, and often this moment will involve a choice. And one of those choices in Shelley's life was the choice to run away with Mary Wollstonecraft, later Mary Shelley. Percy was already married at the time to his first wife, Harriet, who later ends up killing herself after Percy ran away with Mary, which does highlight the fact that though we romanticize these romantic figures both by definition and in practice, they were deeply flawed people. Some of them were just terrible people. Wordsworth, he abandoned a child in France. Lord Byron may have had sex with adolescent boys. If he lived today, he would be a sex offender. He'd be one of those people that you don't want living in your neighborhood. But he didn't live today. He lived 200 years ago, and so, he's heroized instead. Now, Leachy never comes out and says that these are terrible people. While she raises questions about behavior and social dynamics, her scholarship is objective. Next, we come to Volume 6, Endymion Unchained, Poems for John Keats. I confess that Keats is probably my own favorite poet. I was and still am mesmerized by his great odes and their sensuousness and their lyricism. And Arya says herself in an author's note, 10 years ago, when I began this project, my notion of Keats and his life was draped in, and some would say clouded by, the gauze of sentiment. It was as if I were looking down on the planet through the jet stream. Since then, my perception has altered from the entranced poet to one who lauds him, yet sees clearly through the veil. So, as with the other volumes here, there are a good deal of response poems, allusions to the work of the great poet or figure in question. And so it functions as a conversation in verse. Now, if we go to the title poem here, Endymion Unchained, we can see a lot of double references, both to Endymion and perhaps also Keats's own life. Do you hear me, Endymion, on your lust-worn trail? The cliffs and precipice in sight and invite thee. Fain do not reply to their indelicate yea, mirth-laced cry. Though the mouth that beckons sings, nightingale, sweet and unrestrained. Ignoble falsities cursed in gathered puerile chains, chains of ill repute, chains to leave you destitute, pouring forth in a quick, tinctured, maddening scourge. O Endymion, cloak your eyes, wee Cerisius curled waif, whose touch is not regale, nor of the angel's nimbus-hewn pate. Keen your gaze towards the least revealed, but open to one. Her lips a flowering petal, arms untethered, her breast unstained and full sustains. She turns as ought to the ample bower, Diana's lit torch, offering to love, unrefracted true as one being, held in two. Now this is a reference to Keats's first epic poem, Endymion, which is about a handsome shepherd who ruled Elis on Mount Olympus. And in the myth, Selene, or Diana, goddess of the moon, falls in love with Endymion, but Diana, wanting to have him for eternity, longs for eternal youth for Endymion. Zeus grants this, but ensures that Endymion is always asleep, so he dreams of being with her while she caresses and fondles him as he sleeps. So if we look at some of the verbiage here, lust-worn trail, indelicate cry, and the repeated chains, could be seen as a warning against overindulgence, which is a recurring theme in Keats's own work, the tension between the sensuous luxuriance and self-discipline, something he later returns to in his odes. Here we have a reference to the nightingale, references to Ode to a Nightingale. And here the nightingale's song tempts, but the speaker counsels distance, clarity. To read cloak your eyes, keen your gaze, suggests maybe a checking the appetite, refocusing perception. Keats's ideas on negative capability come to mind here. Diana's lit torch, this fits some of the moon imagery we come across in Endymion. The torch's unrefracted light implies truth without distortion. Volume 7, Byron Bound, Lord Byron is probably the most famous out of all these figures just as a personality. And I think that of all these six great romantic poets, his status today might be the lowest. I like to think that's because his greatest genius was as a satirist, and humor tends to not get the same respect as serious stuff does. But I was pleased to see that Ligi makes a case for the singularity of Byron's work in the introduction. She says, more than any other poet of the 19th century, his work stands alone. It is not peppered with the flowery images of Keats, nor even the grand metaphors which were the style of Shelley, but rather with the grit and salt of humanity. And she goes on to say that where Keats wrote from imagination, Byron wrote from experience. Which is, of course, true. Byron's work has heavy autobiographical elements that are lacking in everyone but Wordsworth. And in some way more than Wordsworth, Byron represents not so much the egotistical sublime as his own literary archetype. While one can see precursors in Milton's Satan, maybe Marlowe's overreaching characters, the Byronic hero is a unique figure. As a fictional character, he's really central to the whole 19th century. And as we might expect, Ligi peels away the layers of romanticism behind the man as popular archetype. She approaches Byron's public image and also the private strain behind it. So let's look at the title poem, Byron Bound. How can we not be bon ami, whilst your mind comes nearer drifting, effulgent, effervescent sea? I plead not as man, but lover, sweetest friend, pillaging that trail, muffs, coattails, and farthingales, dancing that flowing river bend. The waterway descends into pure succulence, that forever, bound in glosses delicious ends. And the footnote says Byron revered women with whom he could converse on a wide range of subjects. And we see the speaker addressing Byron in a friendly and intimate register, somewhere between admirer and lover. Then we have this move into a costume-filled scene, this muffs, coattails, farthingales, turning into motion, and then the final turn places pleasure and language together. Byron himself has a lot of sea imagery in his work, and so this reference to the effulgent, effervescent sea is apt. And Byron was, of course, a social performer, so the references to the costume elements is also apt. And we do have some light rhyme here. We have the lover and forever echoes, although the lines are separated so you don't notice it as much. The drifting and descending as moving words. Ami and see, bend and ends. And the theme seems to be that public style feeds private pleasure. Volume 8, Exquisite Rain, Poems for Leigh Hunt. So Hunt is best remembered as being the social connective and the glue for other figures here. He was a writer, of course, but maybe more known as a host. And so the book treats hospitality as a cultural practice. It's true, of course, that a well-run room can help people think and speak well. And if we look at the poem Heart Song, we come to one of the most famous episodes that Hunt is associated with. Didst I leave it on the beach? O sparkling, unburning ball, a bit of hope, a bit of light, refracting off the darkening wall. This refers to when Leigh Hunt was present when Percy Shelley was cremated on a beach on the coast of Italy after he drowned. It's said that Hunt reached into the burning pyre and ripped out Shelley's heart before it could be consumed by flames, and then he later gave it to Mary Shelley, who kept it for the rest of her days. Although I have read that maybe it wasn't Hunt who ripped out his heart, it was somebody else. So I think there's maybe a little bit of argument as to who exactly took Shelley's heart. But Ligi ascribes this to Hunt. The subject of poetic relics is one of particular interest to me. I think we've gotten away from that. We need to be preserving the physical remains of some of these poets living today. If there's anyone who's interested in preserving my organs or perhaps my toenail clippings, do reach out. I'd be more than happy to oblige you. Moving back to the poem, though, I think it's very interesting this poem functions as a closing piece. It's the last in the collection. Volume 9, Bel Esprit, Poems for Lady Blessington. Now here we come to a figure who is the least known so far of all those I've discussed. I confess I knew nothing whatsoever of her until I read this. Now the collection as a whole, the Romantic series, is organized with 7 volumes devoted equally to men and women respectively. but the male poets are just more well known than the female ones. Now, Lady Blessington is something of a parallel to Leigh Hunt here because Lady Blessington was the hostess of a great salon at night. And she also held one during the day for women, as Leigi tells us. Conversations, of course, shape opinions, so the book studies how talk creates influence. Wit just not as merely entertainment, as a tool for network building. There's a lot of short and punchy poems in this collection. Not that these are absent from others, but there seem to be more here. Many of them have a loose couplet structure, and this does seem to reflect the theme of wit and conversation. The title poem, Bel Esprit, is very short, only 3 lines. But Liji's taking a broad view here, and she's highlighting the extra literary activities of the things that go into literature, the things that help it to succeed. Volume 10, Biondetta, Poems for Lady Caroline Lamb. So I've heard of Lady Caroline Lamb. I didn't really know that much about her, really. She did enjoy a literary career. She is most famous today for being a lover of Lord Byron and characterizing him as mad, bad, and dangerous to know. As Ligi explains in the introduction, Lamb was also instrumental in ruining Byron and forcing him to go into exile, which is something that I didn't know. And the title poem, Biondetta, refers to a story that Caroline wrote in which she was a dog chained to a whipping post, and Byron was the master who left her outside in the cold to die. The central portions of the book do deal with her affair with Byron and its aftermath, her madness, she was probably bipolar, how she tried to kill herself and burned Byron in effigy and then set out to destroy him. And then after he was exiled, she enjoyed this successful literary career. And it goes without saying that the readers will learn a lot about these figures' lives from these pages, which I would say is either a blessing or a curse depending on your readerly inclinations. Biographical verse is kind of a niche genre in some ways, maybe in the sense that it does help to already know something about the figures in discussion. In modernist fashion, there are erudite references all over the place. Each poem in these collections tends to refer to specific biographical events, specific moments, and so knowing background information is useful in getting the most out of these poems. But most people probably aren't going to know this specific information. If you're not a specialist in this field, the footnotes are necessary to understand what's going on. They're not really optional. As is the case with a lot of modernist verse, there is a certain level of difficulty here. This is the antithesis of insta-poetry. You have to be educated to read it. So I often found myself reading the poem, then reading the footnote, then going back to read the poem again in light of that information, and just seeing how she deals with those references. So if you are the scholarly sort, that's something that you'll really love about these books. And if you're not, you'll probably find it a challenge. Speaking as someone who has a lot of footnotes in my own mock epics, I like to read footnotes. I have received reviews to the effect that, if the footnotes weren't there, I wouldn't know what's going on. I'm no stranger to the fact that most people, as Tolkien once said, they want to eat the soup, but they don't want to know what ingredients are in it. That is, they want to savor the story on a subconscious level. They want to be entertained. They don't really want to have to think about the mechanics of structure. Of course, verse itself is just a niche thing today. It's a boutique art. It's something that's practiced by the few. And if you're still watching this right now, then this is the kind of thing that's up your alley. Volume 11, Suffusions, Poems for Mary Wollstonecraft. This is, of course, the mother of Mary Shelley, the famous philosopher, considered the founder of feminism for her vindication of the rights of women, although she also wrote a vindication of the rights of men. You don't really hear about that treatise anymore. She attacked hereditary privilege. I have often wondered what these early proto-feminists would think about later manifestations of their movement if they were resurrected today. In a world where fourth wave feminism, or is it fifth wave now? I can't keep track, has taken on more gender fluid definitions, I'm inclined to think that Wollstonecraft wouldn't recognize a lot of her own views in the present day evolution of feminism. Although I'm sure you could say this about anybody who is the founder of anything. If Martin Luther were revived, would he recognize Lutheranism as his own doctrine? I'm not sure that he would. But I digress. This collection runs to more than 300 pages, making it twice the length of most other volumes in this collection, so this is clearly a subject close to Ligi's heart. And Wollstonecraft was not just some kind of theoretical philosopher. She united argument with daily life. So the book treats thought as something you can use. It's not just a desk hobby. That principles should be visible in ordinary choices. Now, there's a short poem in here called Attic King, which is not a poem that is necessarily representative of the collection or central to it, but is just another one of these very interesting moments in the life of the poet or the figure. In a hackney coach he was then, a lone purveyor of his countrymen, not haughty, nay, not contrite, but a man no less. And then, out the light. And as we read here, this is a reference to the execution of Louis XVI when he was taken to the guillotine. Mary was in Paris at the time and watched this scene happen from a window. And even though she's a person who is, against aristocracy, for republicanism, she still pitied Louis and identified with his loneliness. Volume 12, Heresy's Girl, Poems for Mary Robinson. Here we come to another figure that I was wholly ignorant of. Mary Robinson, a very interesting woman. As Leegee tells us, she wrote her first volume of poetry while living with her husband in debtor's prison. In the poem The Fleet Inn, Leegee treats us to a scene where her husband is dallying with prostitutes in the cell adjacent to hers while she is caring for their young daughter. Despite these difficult times, Robinson did achieve fame for her verse, her novels, her acting on the stage. She became a celebrity. Leegee tells us she was dubbed the English Sappho due to her prolific poetry, which was insightful, and Coleridge actually praised it for ushering in new metrical forms. Now, as the title Heresy's Girl suggests, she led a very unorthodox life. Poems range from struggling to write for money, fearing she had consumption, and getting thrown in debtor's prison again, after some noblemen who were supposed to be paying her annuities just didn't pay her, and she couldn't pay her debts. So a tribute to a remarkable figure of the times. Volume 13, we have Poeen or Powine? I don't really know how to pronounce that. Poems for William Blake. Now, William Blake, of course, needs no introduction. He's one of the great visionaries in literary history and art history. This volume is also very long. It's more than 300 pages. Although, unlike in the Wollstonecraft volume, which has just a lot of poems, this volume alternates between his poetry and his visual artwork. And while there are illustrations, there is artwork in the other volumes, there's just a lot more here. So the book is different from the others in that there is a lot of ekphrastic poetry, poems that describe paintings or artworks. And we encounter some Blakean style verse here. Has the muse gone to sleep? Doth her harp slowly weep? We encounter poems about Blake's vision, his struggle with obscurity, the perception by many of his peers that he was insane. And as in other volumes, we still pierce the veil of the romantic aura here, but I feel like this volume was much less focused on the mundane reality that poets face and much more focused on vision and ideas. Though that's probably because maybe it's better to say that Blake's reality was his vision, that there was really just nothing mundane about the man at all. Now, Leegee does poeticize my favorite anecdote about Blake, which is that he liked to walk around naked in his garden and that visiting friends stumbled upon him like this on at least one occasion. And prelapsarian mean, she says, in the garden we be, Adam and Eve, unsheathed. Guileless forms darken and flower, neath blades, arrest and toil, innocence grave. And then we come to the final volume here, volume 14, Deschirons, Poems for the Blue Stocking Women. This was another subject that was interesting to learn about. This book is fairly long because it's more of a miscellany. It's not about one, it's about several figures. Anne Radcliffe, Charlotte Smith, Lady Morgan, Fanny Burney, Letitia Elizabeth Landon, and Madame de Staël. I was only previously familiar with about half of these figures. And if I could mention a note on style here, there's a skillful deployment of recurring imagery in this volume featuring veils, doors, quills, chains. stones, the sea. These things are not decorative. Veils and doors tend to mark access or denial in the sexual sense, privacy or autonomy. Quills and ink symbolize agency. Chains and even surgery related words, clamped, chomped, bit, harnessed, revolve around social pressure and constraint. The sea is a symbol of danger, stones of steadiness or reliance. I'd also note here, building on what I said earlier about Liji's rhyming style, there I said, it's not predictable, but the rhymes do often occur when the speaker is closing a claim, and the couplet-like endings are, not mere flowery decoration, but they often serve as thesis beats to emphasize the theme or idea of the poem. So that is the series. Lichi is one of not very many modern poets who straddles this modern and traditional divide. The poems are free versy, more accentual than metrical, but not always. There's often a skeleton of iambic meter. There are some lines that scan perfectly. There's also some lines you encounter that would scan perfectly if words were spelled in a normal way, but Lichi will throw in dialect spelling or contraction to upset that expectation, throwing the beat off slightly in the middle of a line. So Ligi is skilled in both of these styles, the metrical and the free verse, which is something that most free verse poets are not. They can't do it because they have no training in writing metrical verse. One observation I have is that people who tend more towards the traditionalist camp will likely see this project as too modernist, while people who tend towards the modern camp, the free verse stuff, will probably see it as too traditional in certain respects, at least in terms of style, if not politics. And just a note on politics, I don't want to get into this too much, but it is interesting to note, and that is because the Romantics were formalists writing before the advent of free verse, and because formalism is more associated with conservatism today, often the Romantic poets will be claimed by conservatives for reasons of style, when really they weren't like that in their own day. I think they also may get slotted into this category because they were just dead white guys, dead European males who weren't diverse, at least in the most famous cases, the men. This is ironic because although Wordsworth and Coleridge did gravitate towards conservatism later in life, in their early life, they were very taken with radical idealism. Certainly, Blake and Shelley were very radical. Byron supported radical liberal causes. Wollstonecraft, obviously very liberal. Her husband, William Godwin, Mary Shelley's father, was also the father of anarchism and advocated for a pantisocracy, which sounds kind of like a utopia where people don't wear pants, but no, the word actually refers to, it means government by all or something like that. So it's a term that means radical democracy, basically. So English Romanticism was, on the whole, a very radical movement, and it's very different in that regard from French Romanticism, whose founder, Chateaubriand, was a conservative. But Arya Ligi is definitely following in the footsteps of her English romantic forebears in terms of her liberal worldview. And in this respect, she is more of a romantic in a lot of ways than someone like myself who writes romantic style verse but doesn't actually truck with the worldviews of those who originally pioneered that style. But I am an artist above all things, so I can recognize the merits of a fellow artist even where I disagree with their work at times. Though it has to be said that Wordsworth, who witnessed the French Revolution and its excesses, came to believe later in life that his early radical principles had been naive. He had a wake up call. And I wish more leftist artists would also have this wake up call. Most of them are privileged, overeducated people who just don't know how good they've had it growing up in the prosperous capitalist West that invented modern medicine and basically everything else worth having in the modern world. So I question the degree to which you can appropriate the political ideals of the past, which were very new and revolutionary at that time. Nobody was saying what William Godwin was saying. Nobody was saying what Mary Wollstonecraft was saying then. We've been living in the shadow of the Romantic tradition for 200 years now, and I would argue that some of those ideals that have become widespread just aren't good. My thoughts about the Romantic poets, at least the male ones, is that while their verse is something that should be emulated today, their lives by and large, should not be. Now, the lesser known female poets, Dorothy Wordsworth, etc., do seem to have been good people who led admirable lives, if not enviable lives. But I think that's just because they had to be. They didn't have the same opportunities for outlandish behavior. Now, there is a way that Ligi is less in the romantic tradition, in the sense that Wordsworth and Coleridge's whole poetic revolution that they expound in lyrical ballads is to speak in the language of men. That is, using plain everyday speech. Now, Wordsworth did still, in practice, use archaisms sometimes when describing the speech of rural rustic types, because that's how they talked. But mostly his style is much more grounded than those of his predecessors. And the high modernism of Ezra Pound is basically completely the opposite of this. Modernist language is highly artificial. And in this vein, Ligi's poetical constructions are not anything somebody would actually say. So, although her work is peppered with archaisms of people who talked that way during that time, the modernist influence, I think, does contrast with the romantic principle to speak in the language of men. Now, speaking in the language of men or women or regular people has mostly been taken too far today, I think. Insta poetry tries to elevate everyday speech into poetry, and it just doesn't work. Poetry, verse, is ultimately art, the best words in the best order, as Coleridge put it. So I don't think artificiality in poetry is bad. I think there needs to be a certain amount of this. And despite my honest disagreements with Aligi regarding politics, I do think that her oeuvre here is a remarkable accomplishment, a remarkable feat of scholarship, especially in her focus on the more obscure historical figures. So, to conclude, the ideal readers of this volume are going to be those partial towards both the modernist free verse and the traditional camps, I think. Those with an intellectual bent that don't mind footnotes. But I think this series is an important contribution to literary studies and poetry as far as increasing knowledge and awareness of this time period and establishing that connection to the past. Thank you, and if you're interested in Ligi's work, you can support her Indiegogo campaign. It is difficult to make a living in the world of poetry, so we try to do what we can. Thank you.